Welcome to the debate. You know, if you look at the natural world, there are these phenomena that just completely shatter our intuition.
Oh, for sure. Things that just don't make sense on the surface.
Right. Exactly. Like, imagine for a second standing in the middle of a sun-baked, cracked desert. The sensory experience is, well, it's one of absolute deprivation.
Yeah, there's nothing but dust, heat, and just, complete dryness.
Right. But structurally, just a few hundred feet below your boots, there is a massive underground aquifer, millions of gallons of pure water, just silently and violently rushing through the bedrock.
So the reality of what you feel on the surface and the structural reality of the depths are in total contradiction. I mean, essentially, you are dying of thirst while standing right on top of an ocean.
Exactly. And that geological paradox, that total dryness on the surface with rushing water underneath, it perfectly captures the profound tension we're diving into today with our source material.
It really does. The central question is, are we walking through a spiritual desert, completely abandoned by a hidden creator, or are we secretly vibrating with the very life of God?
And that is really the core of our disagreement today, because when you look at the text, you see two massive colliding ideas. On one hand, you have this breathtaking eminence, the claim that a human being can actively participate in the divine nature right now.
The rushing water. To me, you simply can't read this text without realizing it is all about radical present tense impartation. I'll be arguing that the text is claiming a literal transformation of our human nature from the inside out. And, I absolutely see the appeal of that framework. But I'll be taking the other side, because I just cannot get past the agony mapped out in these pages.
The cracked desert.
Exactly. The most profound revelation here isn't the victory of a new internal nature. It is the crushing weight of a God who actively hides himself. I'd argue that defining human experience mapped out in this text isn't triumphant participation at all. It is a desperate, persistent cry into the silence.
Well, before we can really understand the silence of God, I think we have to understand what the text claims he actually put inside us.
Okay, fair enough.
If you look at the foundation of the material, the primary thesis that emerges is the present-day possession of eternal life. But we have to be incredibly precise here, because we've been culturally conditioned to think of eternal life as a destination.
Right, like a place you go.
Yeah, we treat it like a golden ticket to a future paradise that you put in your back pocket for after you die. But that is just not how the text uses the term. It defines eternal life as the actual, literal, uncreated life of God himself.
Right, so it is not a location, it's a substance.
Precisely. It is a substance. The text makes these staggering claims. It says believers have been granted promises to become partakers of the divine nature.
And it's not speaking in metaphors there.
No, not at all. It is asserting that through a spiritual rebirth, human beings possess the life and nature of God, essentially belonging to what it calls the species of God.
The species of God, that is a heavy phrase.
It really is, because it implies that God is not just a concept or, a feeling. His actual literal substance is present in your very being.
Yeah.
The entire framework of the New Testament, from the Spirit casting out demons to the complex visions and revelation, it's an architectural operation.
Designed to impart this life.
Exactly, explicitly designed to impart this divine life into mortal bodies. It is a structural reality.
And, I will gladly acknowledge the theological promise of that divine life. You can't ignore it. It is written right there.
Right.
But if we are talking about the lived experiential reality of a human being, like what it actually feels like to wake up every morning, that reality is thoroughly dominated by the paradigm of the hidden God.
How so?
Well, you talk about the architectural framework of impartation, but look at the architectural framework of creation itself. The text points out that God created an entire sprawling universe, and then he hid himself in it.
Yeah.
He hid himself so completely that humanity does not even know where to find him.
You're talking about the agony expressed in the older text, right? Like when Job cries out, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him."
Exactly. God is the ultimate master of camouflage. Even when he is ceaselessly operating, doing countless things in the lives of his people, he veils himself.
He operates in secret.
Right. The text literally notes that he is a God who hides. So my point is, even if there is a rushing aquifer of divine life somewhere deep down in the bedrock of a person's soul, it doesn't change the fact that they are living and breathing on the cracked, dry surface.
You're saying the experience is defined by the absence.
Yes, by the absence, by the transcendence.
I completely understand why you see the experience defined by absence, but I think that perspective fundamentally misunderstands how this internal life actually functions.
Okay, how so?
You are focusing heavily on the visual or sensory absence of God, as if not seeing him means he isn't the dominant reality. Let me offer a different way to look at this. Think about how God's nature operates within us, like the structural DNA inside a physical body.
DNA. So you're saying it's like a silent operating system running in the background.
Yes.
But how does that square with this sheer panic and desperation we see in the rest of the text?
Well, think about it this way. When you look at a human being, you don't see their DNA. It is completely hidden from the naked eye. There's no visual spectacle at all.
True.
You don't feel your cells dividing. You don't feel your genetic code dictating your hair color or your immune system. And yet, that invisible, hidden code is constantly replicating, constantly structuring every single cell, dictating the absolute reality and form of the person.
The silent hum of the machinery?
Yes, the text tells us that the God who hides himself is actually operating inside the believer, working out both the willing and the acting. It is operating silently yet mightily.
Right, but
So the hiddenness you're pointing to, the silence in the universe, is merely a lack of external visual spectacle. It is not a lack of actual presence.
I hear you, but
Just to finish the thought, the divine nature is the substance of the divine life. If you have the life, you have the substance. Because of this, believers are actively constituted with God's riches right now, today. The DNA is replicating. That internal structural transformation is a far more defining reality than the temporary emotional feeling of waiting in the silence.
okay, the DNA analogy is elegant, it really is, because it perfectly explains the mechanics of an internal process. But I have a massive problem with applying it to the totality of this text.
Why is that?
If God's hiddenness is merely a quiet, structural, internal operation, just the happy, silent hum of spiritual DNA doing its work, why on earth does the text use such shocking, frankly scandalous metaphors for the believer's life? Look at the parable of the widow and the judge.
You mean the parable in Luke 18, where the believer is told to pray and not lose heart?
Yes, but look at the specific imagery used. Jesus doesn't compare the believer to a vibrant, newly evolved species of God, humming with internal energy.
No, he doesn't.
He compares the believer to a helpless widow left completely alone on earth. And worse, he compares God to an unrighteous judge who explicitly does not fear God or care about people. That is an incredibly abrasive, almost offensive metaphor for the creator of the universe.
It is definitely a jarring image, frankly.
It's terrifying. The widow, who signifies the believers in this present age, is dealing with an opponent, an adversary. She is in a hostile environment, completely vulnerable, and she has to bother this judge relentlessly.
Right, she just won't stop asking.
She is literally a nuisance to him. The judge explicitly says he will only help her because she is causing him trouble and he doesn't want her to wear him out. I mean, this implies that God deliberately adopts a posture of absolute unresponsiveness and apparent injustice to the believer's present suffering.
But you have to remember,
Just a widow crying day and night to a brick wall of an unrighteous judge. That completely contradicts the warm feeling of intimate internal DNA replication.
but you have to remember that the text immediately contrasts God with that judge. It says God is long-suffering over them, meaning he isn't actually unjust. He is just delaying the vindication for a specific reason.
It is a contrast in his ultimate intent, yes, but not in the experience of the widow. For days, months, maybe years, her lived reality is dealing with a stone wall.
Sure, the feeling is one of absence.
The existential reality mapped out here is that the husband is absent, the world is corrupt, and the believer is left begging for intervention. If they were fully satisfied by this internal aquifer of divine life, they wouldn't be screaming at the judge.
And that is exactly where I have to challenge your reading of that parable.
because I think you are isolating the metaphor from its stated mechanical purpose.
How am I isolating it?
The focus of the parable isn't to declare that God's true character is absent, and it certainly isn't to say that the internal life is insufficient.
Well, it certainly looks that way to the widow.
But look at the text. It tells us right at the beginning the exact purpose of the parable, to teach them that they are always to pray and not lose heart. It is entirely about generating a very specific mechanism. It's about forging what we might call linking faith.
But if the divine life is already structurally complete inside them, I mean, if they have the DNA, why is this grueling process of linking faith even necessary?
Because the development of that life requires resistance. The text makes a crucial distinction between the initial faith of salvation, the moment you first believe and receive that spiritual DNA, and this ongoing linking faith.
Okay, so a daily, active faith.
Right. Linking faith is the persistent, active tether that brings believers into an actual life union where their human thoughts and the divine life sync up. So I have to ask, isn't the apparent absence of God in this age strictly a pedagogical tool?
Wait, a pedagogical tool? Calling the agonizing silence of God a pedagogical tool drastically softens the harsh reality of human suffering. It makes it sound like a controlled classroom exercise.
Not a classroom exercise, but a highly controlled environment designed for growth. By appearing as an unrighteous judge, by deliberately withdrawing a sensory, emotional experience of his presence, God forces the believer to exercise linking faith.
Like building a muscle.
Exactly. A muscle only grows when it encounters resistance that breaks it down. By withdrawing, God provides the resistance.
And what actually is linking faith? It isn't just human willpower. The text defines it as the triune God moving inside us to link us to his unsearchable riches.
I see what you're saying, but
The act of crying out day and night isn't proof of God's absence. The cry itself is the hidden God operating within the believer to bridge the gap.
look, I understand the mechanics of what you're saying, but minimizing the trauma of the hiddenness to a mere tool of resistance just doesn't do justice to the text.
I'm not trying to minimize it. It is, absolutely. The suffering and the need for avenging are profoundly real. The text talks about escaping the corruption which is in the world by lust. This is a highly toxic, hostile environment.
It is. Absolutely.
And look at how the text practically defines this breaking point of faith. It describes believers who are so pressed, so burdened beyond their strength, that they literally despair of life itself. They have the sentence of death in themselves.
Exactly, which completely breaks down their reliance on their natural human abilities.
Right. They hit a wall where they literally cannot rely on their own human strength anymore. Their only option is to trust in a God who raises the dead.
Right.
But if the believers were fully resting in the realized triumph of their new divine identity, if the DNA was just happily humming along, and that was the totality of their experience, they wouldn't need to be pushed to the brink of death.
Well, they are still in a physical body.
Yes, and they're crying out because the corruption of the world and the silence of God are overwhelming external realities that threaten to crush them. Look at the climax of that parable in Luke 18. It is haunting. Jesus asks, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?"
Meaning the persistent linking faith of the widow.
Yes. But notice what he does not ask. He doesn't ask, when the Son of Man comes, will he find the divine nature on the earth? He doesn't ask if he will find fully replicated spiritual DNA.
That's a fair point.
He asks if he will find faith. The defining metric of a believer's success in this hidden age is not their actual makeup or their internal possession of life. The metric is their desperate, persistent reliance on an unseen God against all odds. The wrestling is the point.
That is a powerful distinction. It really is. But I think you are setting up faith and the divine nature as if they are in competition with one another.
How so?
The text actually resolves this tension chronologically. You are looking at a snapshot of the believer in the middle of the desert and calling it the whole story. But the progression of eternal life is laid out in stages.
Stages. Walk me through how that changes the widow's experience.
The text shows us that obtaining eternal life is not a flat one-time event that immediately results in perfection. It is a massive developmental arc. It starts in this age, where we pass out of death into life. It continues with a manifestation in the coming age, and finally, it is enjoyed fully in eternity.
Okay,
So the widow experience, the screaming into the silence, is just the developmental phase.
So the agony is just a phase we have to endure until the DNA fully takes over.
It is the mechanism by which the DNA grows. Let's go back to the text that claims we are partakers of the divine nature. It doesn't just stop there. It immediately pivots and lays out a rigorous structural progression.
The list of virtues.
Yes, it says you have to supply virtue to your faith, then knowledge, then self-control, endurance, godliness, brotherly love, and finally, love. This is the divine seed growing into maturity.
Right.
And what is the result of that structural development? The text says that by doing this, an entrance into the eternal kingdom will be richly and bountifully supplied to you. The widow phase, the agonizing silence, is simply the pressure cooker that forces the divine nature to express itself through those stages.
That is incredibly well-reasoned, but let's take a look at what actually happens at the end of that chronological progression. Let's look at the coming kingdom you just brought up, the ultimate conclusion of this whole process, the 1,000-year reign.
The ultimate reward for the believers who mature, yes.
Right. The text specifically notes that when that kingdom arrives, God is looking for a very specific group. He is looking for what the text calls overcomers.
Yes.
And who exactly are these overcomers? They are the ones who lived by this desperate linking faith. They are the ones who endured a deeply corrupt world, who faced intense persecution, who maybe even lost their lives for their testimony, all while God remained hidden in the heavens.
And because they endured, they received the crown of life.
They do. And they are regarded as treasures, reigning for 1,000 years. But my point is this: what actually qualifies them for that incredible honor? It isn't simply possessing the seed of the divine life.
Well, no, it's the maturity.
Right, but every single believer has that seed. The aquifer is under everyone's feet. What separates the overcomers is that they survived the desert. They wrestled with the hidden God.
Right?
They endured the apparent injustice. They bothered the unrighteous judge day and night. They held on to faith when every shred of sensory evidence screamed that they were completely abandoned. I argue that this wrestling, this agonizing, terrifying navigation of God's hiddenness, is the ultimate crucible. It defines a believer's worth in the coming kingdom far more than the mere internal possession of uncreated life.
But don't you see that they absolutely couldn't wrestle in the desert without the water from the aquifer sustaining them?
I'm not denying the water exists.
But you cannot separate the endurance of the widow from the divine nature operating within her. Think about it. If God is fundamentally love and the believer is abiding in that love, that uncreated life is the structural fuel for the persistent prayer.
Okay.
The endurance you are so rightly praising in the overcomers isn't human grit. It is literally one of the attributes supplied by the divine nature. It's God's own uncreated life expressing itself as endurance under the crushing pressure of his own hiddenness.
I completely agree that it is not human endurance. We already established that linking faith requires having zero trust in oneself. It requires the total collapse of human capability.
Exactly.
But the absolute catalyst for that divine endurance to activate in the first place is the absence of God. Think about it. If God walked visibly among us right now, fully present, continuously parting the clouds to strike down our opponents and answer every prayer instantly, we wouldn't need linking faith.
No, we wouldn't.
We wouldn't need the parable of the widow. The entire ecosystem of human spiritual growth right now is entirely predicated on the fact that God is withdrawn from our senses. The hiddenness isn't just a detail, it is the defining boundary condition of our existence.
You know, I think we're actually circling around a really profound paradox here. And it might be exactly where our perspectives start to intersect.
I think so too.
If I can just sort of summarize my position, I firmly hold that the foundation of the text is that eternal life is a present structural reality. Through an incredible architectural operation, believers actively partake in the divine nature.
Right.
They possess God's literal, uncreated life. And even when God hides himself, even when the world feels completely silent, he is operating silently and mightily within them. The DNA is constantly at work fundamentally altering what it means to be human from the inside out.
And from my perspective, while I absolutely validate the reality and the promise of that uncreated life, the defining existential reality mapped out in the text is the profound transcendence of a hidden God.
The desert.
The desert. The metaphor of the helpless widow and the unrighteous judge is simply too raw, too central, and just too deeply felt to ignore. It reveals that the human experience right now is meant to be characterized by vulnerability.
Yeah.
It is about maintaining a desperate, persistent faith in the face of absolute divine silence, trusting in a God who raises the dead, precisely because we feel like we are dying in the desert.
What is endlessly fascinating to me is that despite coming from completely opposite angles, we both arrive at linking faith as the critical bridge.
We do. We both see that persistent tether as the key.
Right.
For me, linking faith is the glorious evidence of the divine life moving internally, connecting us to God's riches despite the external circumstances.
And for you, well, for me, it's that internal proof. But for you, linking faith is the necessary, agonizing human response to the external reality of a completely concealed creator.
Exactly. We agree on the bridge, but we disagree on which side of the chasm is the defining feature of the landscape.
Is the defining feature the boundless water flowing invisibly deep underground? Or is it the cracked, sun-baked desert on the surface where we actually have to walk every single day?
It's a tension that the text just refuses to neatly resolve for us.
And perhaps that is exactly the point. The source material beautifully captures the complex paradox of what it means to be human and spiritual.
It really does.
We are asked to hold two seemingly impossible truths at the exact same time, to know with absolute certainty that we contain the very uncreated, eternal nature of God within us, while simultaneously finding ourselves crying out day and night to a God who seems impossibly far away.
A God who hides himself, yet grants us his own life. It is beautiful and terrifying all at once.
We invite you, the listener, to dive into the text for yourself. Look at the incredible promises of impartation, read through the desperate parables, and consider the silence of the older prophets. Decide which perspective resonates most deeply with the true nature of faith. Are you resting in the silent, powerful operation of the divine structure, or are you crying out as the widow in the desert? It's a tension worth wrestling with.